we're live. Hi, everyone. We are back on the stage with a very special treat today. We have Jeff Forbes, Dr. Jeff Forbes, with us this morning. He is currently at the National Science Foundation. He's the program director. I'm going to just let him introduce himself because he's got a huge bio. But before he does, I want to say that it's been a pleasure having to work with Jeff over many, many years. I think we met, it's been years. And his professionalism, his expertise, but just more than that, he's just, just a wonderful friend that I've gotten to know over the years. And we invited him here today with us to talk to us about what's happening at the National Science Foundation. And we, felt this was really important to have some time for him to share some information, because this is really driving a lot of the efforts on broadening participation and honing in on, equity in CS. So Jeff, welcome. We're so happy to have you here with us. I'd like for you to maybe start us off by introducing yourself and what your role is at the National Science Foundation.
So thank you so much, Lynn, and thank you all for being here. I'm really excited about this opportunity and really delighted about this summit. Right? I think it's incredibly timely, and you've had a really impressive program. So I feel a little small coming in here at the end. Like, I'm not sure if I can compare, but I'm really enjoying it anyway. I work at the National Science Foundation. I'm a program director there, working on programs in our Directorate for Computer and Information Science and Engineering. Specifically, I work on programs that deal with anything with computing education or broadening participation in computing. Broadening participation is NSF's fancy way of saying, we need to make sure that we have equitable participation in our disciplines and in our workforce. It's not just about making sure that the people who've traditionally been in the field are in the field, right? We need to make sure that people who have been historically marginalized or underrepresented are present in our fields. So in that role at NSF, I'm, you could say broadly, what do we care a lot about? We're trying to think about how can we have all students, and all is doing a lot of work here, engage and learn about computing. And computing is our way of saying, is NSF's way of saying computer science, information science, and computer engineering. But, as far as when we talk about K-12, we really mean computer science. And all is really important because at NSF, we have a responsibility for thinking about our research pipeline, right? So we worry about making sure that we have robust computing research community, right? That's important, and that needs to be representative of our population, because what we do in computing has huge impact for our society. We're seeing that even more today, right? We have systems that have been created by some of our colleagues that, instead of addressing equity, sometimes will make things worse, right? If we're going to have predictive policing algorithms that actually are going to further marginalize Black and brown communities, that's not helpful, right? If we're going to have vision systems that only work or produce erroneous results for people of color, that's also a problem. But beyond thinking about research, we're also tasked at NSF with thinking about making sure we have a computationally competent workforce, right? So that includes someone who might be a software engineer, but also includes someone who in their work is going to have to think about, how do I use computing to automate some tasks? How do I use the tools that I have effectively? And finally, we care about our overall citizenry, right? Like everyone should have the opportunity and the ability to really be enabled by computing. So I've been at NSF since August, but I had previously done a stint at NSF from 2011, 2014, where I got to work with Lynn quite a bit and rely on her expertise, in particular, anything that involves high school teaching, and because the real central pillar of the work that we were working on was around computer science principles and how we could develop an engaging, rigorous, and accessible, but still focused on equity introduction to computing that was really going to rethink what high school computer science meant. And it has, through her and her colleagues' efforts, really been a success. So that was a pretty long-winded thing. Should I say like how I got to NSF, what my job is, or what do you want?
No. I think that was great. I just wanted to follow up a little bit on, some of the things that you've been working on. You're right. We met when we were developing the computer science principles course that was also supported by Jan Cuny at the time while you were there or with her. But it was initiated by this, CS10K project, and then now the broadening participation in computing efforts. It's been a decade now, and so I just wanted to ask if you might share from your perspective, like, what have you seen in terms of improvements over the last 10 years? And, how do you see NSF moving forward to keep this at the forefront and making sure that CS for All and BPC, stays a significant part of advancing CS education?
So that's a really good question. Yeah, you point out this has been going on for a while. So in some ways, we are in an entirely different position than we were 10 years ago in terms of the opportunities that exist in computer science and the breadth of opportunities. But in a lot of ways, we still have a lot of progress. So we're focused on a number of different issues. When we think about high school, it's still so much about the teachers. How can we better support teachers? How can we retain teachers? How can we make sure that when you bring computer science to a school, that we don't fall into the same challenges that we had before? We want to make sure that the students who take computer science reflect the school as a whole. And at minimum, the students taking AP computer science should not, we want to make sure that at least as many, there are at least as many female students, for example, we should have in computer science as we do in AP calculus, right? I mean, there's no reason why we shouldn't have, we've had some progress in terms of broadening the participation, particularly of female students, African-American, Hispanic, Native American, and other indigenous people in high school computer science, but we still aren't anywhere close to where we want. We still aren't where we want to be. So that's something we're thinking about. And then there are policy issues. NSF doesn't deal too much with policy, but some of our awardees are just trying to think about what does it take to maintain computer science in high school and continue to broaden it. So we do fund work that's slightly more technical sometimes in terms of thinking about how do you assess everything, but that's one strand. Then another strand is how do you have pathways in computer science? So it's not just we want to have a CS principles class, but what if you want to have multiple classes so that students can have some exposure at some point, but then build upon that so that they are better able to follow on in their dreams wherever computing might enable those dreams post high school. So pathways are a thing. And then there's a lot of innovation that's happening in prior to high school as well. In the K-8 space, there are lots of different places where you can have computing, lots of different ways you can integrate computing into other subjects or have a computing project as part of it. So there's a lot of innovation there as well. And trying to understand, like, how do we effectively do this, right? So we've opened up so this year we have a new research strand in our main call for proposals, which is the CS for All program. And this research strand, just think about how do you effectively, improve teaching or study, how students learn computer science at the introductory levels. So that's what we're focusing on right now. But it turns out that because of all the great work that's happening at high school, it also has implications to what happens in college. So it's not at all okay that the student has this great experience and takes computer science principles in high school, gets to college, and then they come in and then they find they don't find it engaging. They don't find it speaks to them. They don't find that the teaching has the same focus on equity. So what happens in that articulation to college, and what do we need to do at the undergrad level to make sure things work?
Yeah, I am so glad that you mentioned, this bridge between secondary and post-secondary, which is something, that we've been working here at the Constellation Center on for the last couple of years, is really figuring out what's happening at the high school level and then bridging, any gaps into post-secondary STEM and CS studies. It's easier said than done. And I'm wondering if you can speak a little more to what you envision needs to happen at the post-secondary level, being, having been at Duke for, more than 15, 17 years or something like that. You yourself are a college university CS professor. So from your perspective and the experiences that you have, share with us, what do you think needs to happen then to help with that transition? What changes do you see as necessary that should happen at the post-secondary level?
Mm-hmm. So great question. So if you're trying to say, how do we teach computing effectively to all students, right? And now we're talking about all college students as well. So there are a lot of things you need to consider. One is you have to consider the context in which these students and the universities are operating. So there's a lot of, in computer science, students come in with different levels of background, but different levels of preparatory privilege, right? It's not just, it's different than people come in with different math backgrounds. Absolutely, that happens as well. But the, breadth and, difference that people can have coming into computing is really can make it so that students have fundamentally different experiences in some of our intro courses. So we wanted to figure out how can you maintain a continued focus on broadening participation, thinking about equity in those intro courses in the midst of everything those students are going through. They're going through a world which they have to deal with emergency remote teaching. They have to deal with the pandemic. They have to deal with the fact that people are being, people that look like them are just, being shot sometimes with no consequences. That is something that they have to deal with. And at the same time, universities have to deal with that they are trying to deal with, emergency teaching, and computer science departments were already dealing with, they have all this enrollment pressure because so many students are taking this. So how do you get a department that's like, we can barely handle the students that we have, still think about, I need to care about you, student, and your background, and make sure that we're still being able to attend to your issues. So I think that maintaining that continued focus on equity is really important. And another place that we're actually spending a lot more time thinking about is the role of two-year colleges. A lot of students go to two-year colleges and they play a particularly important role for computer science, both in sometimes that they offer dual enrollment, but also like a lot of people go to two-year college and they often have a very broad set of students that you don't see at the four-year college. So for those students who do want to transfer, how do we facilitate effective transfer pathways? But if they want to see the two-year degree and then go out into industry, how can you also do that?
Yeah.
And then a big thing we also think about is how do you do computing in the context of other disciplines? So CS plus X, as we think about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, you mentioned earlier, challenges and issues with the calls for social justice and also the impact of the coronavirus, COVID-19. One question that I wanted to ask you is, what do you think might be some of the lessons learned from the outcomes of these pandemics, as I call them, two pandemics, not just the coronavirus, but also, this other pandemic that has been going on for many years, structural racism in our country. What are some lessons learned that not only can we apply, but also governmental agencies like NSF can apply? How do you see those lessons learned integrated into how NSF will move forward?
So that's a great question. I tend to think that what we're seeing is that this, you take existing differences in resources, differences in, you take existing gaps, and now you're making them even worse, right? So now you're telling the student who doesn't have great internet access or doesn't have a lot of people in their social network who can tell them, how to do all these problems. Now they're forced to sit there on their own and work through these problems while other people have more. And similarly, some universities can transition to online much easier because they have more resources to do it and they can. So we're exacerbating gaps. And then you add on top of that the social justice issues, right? So now you're saying, so for the students who for me, who we most care about, they're having to deal with even more. So what I am concerned about is that, right now we're at this point where we could have a substantial rollback in some of the progress we're making towards like equity. And that, is horrible. And so
devastating.
What can we do? Well, first, be intentional about that. Understand that this is likely to have differential impacts and design programs that specifically are going to address that. So that's one place where I'm hoping that we can make a difference. And then maybe we have to start thinking more broadly about, and I'm challenging myself to do this, about what are the goals and how do we get there? And how do we make sure that these goals about justice, these goals about equity are not just a side thing, but, as we like to say, it's a first order goal, right? This is not just a small thing. This is what we're about. If you want to do computer science for all, how are you going to do that in the context of the inequitable world that we live in the context of places where, the opportunities, it's not that they're uneven, right? They're just completely stacked, and it's not like this and by design. So how can we be intentional in actually addressing those?
Yeah. Well, Brian is back on with us now to help us with some questions or comments in the chat. So, Brian, want to start us off with the question?
Certainly. First, Jeff, you're getting a lot of kudos in the chat. Folks are screaming out the Blue Devils, and
although I have to say something about that, because this is relevant, is that I've been working at Duke for 19 and a half years, but actually next week, I'm going to start working at Georgia Tech with Lynn here. So I very much appreciate my time at Duke, but I am incredibly excited to be working with the folks in Constellations. So
I just
welcome
want
to
to
Georgia.
say,
We got more food.
I have been waiting for the right time for Jeff to make this announcement, and I don't know if you can see the smile on my face, but we're super excited, Jeff. Super excited. So
yeah, obviously, I think one of the big ways we can address this is to be intentional about it, and I think
absolutely
is the best place to do that. I think there's obviously, based on my decision, that I think there's no place better and no better people to work with than Constellations in terms of addressing these big issues.
Although I know you'll still be on loan to NSF, so you know, we'll work it out though.
Yes.
That's exciting news, Jeff. Welcome. First question from Lily Tarula in New York City. She wants to know, how do you see the K-5 grade band as affecting the potential pipeline towards feeling comfortable in taking APCS? So she's a K-5 teacher. How do we?
So yeah, there's some really good work in that area. So I'd say like one project that we funded, Everyday Computing, is trying to get students exactly that, comfortable with computing, so that you can build upon what they've done in K-5 so that they can be more effective in middle school and thus be more effective in high school, which then sets them up for everything in college. So I would look at Everyday Computing. It's out of University of Chicago. Diana Franklin works on that as one exemplar, but there are a lot of other ones. But I think this idea of K-5 being an important place is true.
Okay. And this next question is from April DeGeneiro, who would probably want to say more, follow up with that about K-5 AI, but her actual question was, if 20% of a total population is X, what percentage of a class should be X? And she says, I know the closer to 20%, the better, but mathematically, what would be a realistic percentage to reach? And this is a question that I also have dealing from a state perspective, because those are the numbers that I look at.
Yeah.
So so I mean, it's hard not to say, well, 20%, like, why not? Now when people push back on that, I am willing to look at other baselines. So there's what the school is, but then again, I think sometimes, I'll just be honest, we as computer science folks make excuses that are reasonable, but we don't have to make them, right? If we should be able to do as well as some other disciplines. There are broader issues you have to deal with, but I just keep running back to, like, math is fun. I love math. If math can have 50% women, so can computer science. Now there are reasons why, math is taught from kindergarten up through, but that's where we're trying to go. And similarly, like, many states, they have a much higher percentage of Black students taking the AP Calculus test than they do the AP Physics, AP Computer Science test. Why can't we do better on that?
So what I hear you saying is that the percentage of the population is still the goal. Like,
it's still the goal, but you can perhaps say, well, instead of the school, we're going to look at because if you're talking about AP, maybe you talk about the students who take AP at that school. Fine, I'll go with that. But what I resist things to say, well, it's okay if we don't get to blah. Now, I'll just speak as someone who works in colleges. We're so far when people celebrate when they get to 20%. So it's kind of hard to, like, you give people credit for the trajectory that we look a lot at trajectories, right? That's, you don't have to get to equity, but where are you trending in that? So that matters a lot.
Sure. Lily had another question, and I know we're getting close to time. And I have a question as well. So I'm gonna go with Lily's first because I don't want to be selfish. But do we also look at the target of success in Algebra 1 as a key lever towards getting students into CS at the 9, 12 grades? And in New York, a lot of Algebra 1 is taken in 8th grade, which is why she asked.
Yes. So there's so this is actually an interesting, active research topic, and I, in fact, very much invite people who want to contribute to this to send me an email. This connection between algebra and computing performance makes sense, and it's certainly, you know, I certainly believe it, but we need a bit more evidence sometimes on this. But yeah, I do think there are things like Bootstrap, which are trying to directly address this by saying, well, let's incorporate computing into your algebra class so that students will just do better in algebra. Like, I think that's a good idea. But I also do think this issue of, if students don't take 8th grade algebra, then are we telling them that they can't take computer science? That is not good. And I have a very long rant, but I don't have time for this, about unnecessary requirements for computing courses at the college level. So, like, you don't need to take, at most schools, you don't have to take, like, your calculus course will not help you do better, but you have to take calculus before you can take the computer science course. And that ends up being a gating function sometimes for students who most want to have in the discipline.
Mm-hmm. Agreed.
That's agreed. Yeah.
And that's, again, for someone who loves calculus. So that.
Yeah. Agreed. We are right at time, a little bit over time, and there are still some questions that we didn't get to, Jeff. And what we've been asking attendees to do is to send those to us. If we miss any questions, that we would send them, that they could send them to us, and or they could, if you're willing, contact you directly as well, or we can forward those to you. You know, the chat's coming in. It's like nonstop. So we're trying to get to them. If you could stay on for a few minutes, maybe to run through the chat and answer some of the questions, that would be great. Also, if not, we'll get them. We'll get them to you one way or another. But either way, Jeff, it's been a pleasure to have you on with us today. Thank you so much for your time. I know that you're in the middle of like panel reviews, this month or this week, but it's so awesome to have you as part of our program. Thank you for being on with us.
Thank you. I really appreciate this opportunity. Appreciate all of you out there for the great questions as well. Thank you.
Yeah, great to see you again, man. And